And welcome back to Introduction to XPage's Development, a video blog series at pauldn.com. Part 4, Display a Domino document on an XPage. This blog series is based on Introduction to XPage's Development, a free course available at tlcc.com. In this Part 4 in the series, I'll be focusing on this lesson, Display a Domino document on an XPage. In a traditional Domino or Notes application, the Forms and View design elements form the main part of the UI for the application. In Part 3, we created an XPage to display the columns from a Domino view, the Customers by Name view in our Customers application. In this Part 4, we're going to create another XPage to display the contents of the customer documents. So, what is a document? Well, a document is mostly a collection of fields with values. They also have some properties like a unique document identifier, but mostly I like to think of a document as just that, a collection of fields with values. This Bob Saunders document was created using the contact form, which has 3 text fields defined on the form. We see in the document properties on the Fields tab that Notes added the location and the name and the phone fields to the document when it was created, but it also added some internal dollar fields like $updated by to keep track of everyone who's modified this document. And the form field, which is the name of the form that was used to create this document, and it is also the form to merge with this document when opened in a traditional Notes or Domino application. Now, in an XPages application, the form is used only to define the data schema for the Domino document data source. That is, what fields are available for display on the XPage. Turning to my Notes workspace, I see the Customers, Parts, and Sales applications, my data sources for my XPage applications, and Design NSF, where I'm creating my XPages and my XPages resources. The Customers application is the application where we're going to continue to develop our XPages. In the last part, Part 3, we created an XPage to display this view, the Customer by Name view. In this part, Part 4, we're going to create the second XPage to display the contents of the document. So I'm seeing the Fox Run Golf Course document and the kind of information for that particular customer. And when I close that and return to the view, I can see my Customer by Name view. So we're going to create this 2-page scenario where we have one XPage, the one we created last time, to display the contents of the Customer by Name view. And we'll need to make some modifications so that when we click on a link in that view, like the Las Vegas golf course, it's going to open up another XPage to display the contents of the Domino documents. There are 2 approaches to add a Domino document data source to an XPage. You can add it at the time you create a new XPage, or after you've created an XPage on the Data tab, you can add a document data source there. There are also 2 approaches to adding your input controls and binding them to the fields in your Domino document data source. The first approach is a little bit more involved. It's a 2-step process where you first add in the appropriate input control, like an edit box control, and then step 2 is on the Data tab for that control, bind that control to the appropriate field in the data source, in this case the Document 1 data source, and in this case the Customer field in that Document 1 data source. With this approach, you're also responsible for all of the alignment and adding labels maybe in the left-hand column of a table and the input controls in the right-hand column of the table. The second approach is a lot quicker and certainly recommended for most of the fields in your Domino document data source. It involves going to the Data tab, selecting the fields that you want from the data source on the XPage, and then simply dragging and dropping them into the location on the XPage where you want them to appear. The result is you automatically get a 2-column table with labels in the left-hand column and fields or input controls in the right-hand column that are automatically bound to the appropriate fields in the document data source. Switching to Designer, we see Design NSF, where we're going to create our new XPage, and Customers. This is where our data source is, so moving into the Forms, I see the Customer form. And these are the types of fields that are part of my data source: customer and contact and address and so on. I see this disp customer, and this is a computed for display field. So the computed for display type fields are not part of my data source. They'll be excluded from my data source listing and they won't show up on the data tab. Here in Design NSF, where I'm creating my XPages, I can see the customer by name view that I created in the last part. Just very quickly look at the design. It has a view panel control with columns for the customer, city, contact, and phone. So we're going to create the second XPage within Design.NSF to display the customer documents. So I'm going to create a new XPage. Let's call this the customer document. And I can add a data source at the time I create it. So this time I'll do that. I'm going to create a Domino document data source and add that to the XPage. It's in another application. It's in that customers application. In my TLCC demo path, customers xp9 cust.nsf. And the form to use is the customer form that we just looked at. By default, the data source name will be document 1. You can provide a more descriptive name. However, I'm going to just go with document 1. And the result when I say OK is my new customer document XPage is created. I can see on the Data tab the definition of my document 1 data source to that customer form in the Customers application. And it has the data source name of document 1. I can also see on the Data tab the listing of all the data sources on this XPage, just the one, document 1, and all of the fields. I can see that customer field. I don't see that display customer field, that computed for display field. Now that first approach, that manual approach, doesn't use the data palette, so I'm going to minimize that and let me rearrange some things here. A little less for the properties view. Let's expand our outline view. And we can see in our outline view at this point we just have the XPage with the data source added to the XPage. So from the container controls, I add a panel as I always do. And in the styling, I want to add those margins, but first I need a style sheet on this XPage, so selecting my XPage, going to the resources, I'm going to add that style sheet that I created in an earlier part in this series, the My Style style sheet. So with that added to my XPage, I can select my panel, and on the Style tab, choose the margins 25 to get that 25 pixel margin around that panel. Now into that panel, I'm going to add a table, and it in fact will be 2 rows, and let's go with 12 rows and 2 columns. I think I have about 12 fields in that data source. Okay, so I'll add that, and then I'll begin to build this out. So for each field I want to display, like the customer field, I'd add a label. Provide a label property like customer, and let's add another label for the contact name. And then next to each one of these labels I would add an edit box control, and then go to the Data tab and choose to bind that to a field in my document 1 data source. So using simple data binding, choosing first my data source, just the document 1 on this XPage, and choosing the customer field. And then I can do that, repeat that process to add another input control that will be bound to the contact, and so on. So that's the manual approach, and it's a little cumbersome, but certainly works. And let's take a look at what I'm going to do is I'm going to reverse all of that. I'm going to select this table and delete all of that. And let's take a look at the second approach, which involves using the data palette. So from the data palette, I can select all of those fields that I want to add. I can choose to exclude some. We don't really use this referral field anymore, so not necessary to capture that information on our XPage, so we'll just skip that one. And I'm going to uncheck this. And the reason I'm going to uncheck this is because I want to be interrupted with a dialog box where I can make some further choices when I drag and drop all of these into the location on the XPage. Okay, so this is the dialog box that I get when I uncheck that I want to show the select data bound controls. And this gives me options to reorder things, so I can move things up and down. I'll just put that back the way it was. And I can choose different types of controls. So for this state field, maybe I'll have a DB lookup for that. So I could choose a combo box control for that. And for the type, that's also a selection type control. So I can choose combo box, or I can choose list box. Now there are other selection type controls like radio button group control and checkbox group control. They're not available in this interface, but for any other type of selection type control. So even if this is going to end up being a radio button group control, I might choose one of these two selection type controls and then make some modifications afterwards. Region, that's also a selection type control, so I'll choose one of those. And status, another selection type control. Okay, you can see some of your other choices that are available to you. And other products. That's going to end up being a checkbox control, but again, that's not available to me, so I'll select one of these selection type controls. Now another thing I can do is choose these options here. So I can add a submit button automatically, and I can also choose to add a messages control. And what that does is it provides me some error messages when there are validation errors. So I can choose that as well. And I can choose to save these settings or not for the next time that I drag from the data palette. So I'll say OK. And the result is this. So we got a two-column table with labels that have label values or label property values that were derived from the actual field name. So we got customer, and for this one here, since this field name is sales potential and since camel case was used, designer was smart enough to split that label up into sales space potential. Okay, so if you have camel case, it'll do that for you. But of course you can modify any of those if you wanted to. And each one of these input controls, okay, like these edit box controls, they have an ID that was also derived from the field name. So the ID for this control is customer 1, and for this next one, it's contact 1. And if I look at the source with that selected, I can see that this is the ID property for the control that we're talking about right now. Okay, ID equals contact 1. Now, while we're here in the source, value equals, and then we have in quotes, hashtag, and then in curly braces, we have document1.contact. So that's our document1 data source, and specifically the contact field within that. So here in Designer, on the Data tab, we see that simple data binding to the document1 data source, specifically the contact field within that. Okay, at this point, it's a good time to preview my customer document XPage. So we're going to preview that. and save and compile my changes. And I see it here in the browser. And I see my labels in this left-hand column of a table, not seeing the table borders. I see my input controls and my combo box controls. Not a lot of choices here, so this is the next part of our series where we're going to talk about creating and updating Domino documents with an XPage. For now, what I want to do is really just preview existing documents. So returning to Designer, let's see how we would do that. This is the customer by name view XPage that I created in the last part. And there's a couple of changes that I need to make here. But before I make any, let me just preview it. And this is how we left it in part 3 in our series. So we have the value of the customer column and city and contact and phone. Now what I want to do here is enable links in this customer column so that when the user clicks on them, it opens up that other XPage I just created, the customer document XPage. So here in the design, the first step in the process is to select that customer column, and then on the display tab, check off this show values in this column as links, and then specify, well, the default is edit, but I'm going to choose read only. So I want those documents to open in read only mode. The second step in the process is to select the view control, the view panel control, and on the view tab in the properties, at runtime, open selected document using, and this is where we choose that other XPage I just created, the customer document XPage. And those are the two steps. So first, enable which column, and you can put this on several columns if you want to link on several columns, but I'm just going to put it on this customer column. So enable certain columns as links, at least one, and then in the view properties specify which XPage to open at runtime. So let me preview that, and I'll save and compile those changes. And now I see the customer column showing as links, and when I open this one for Fox Run Golf Course, it opens up that customer document XPage and the appropriate document. So I can see the details for that Fox Run Golf Course. And I can't really return to view, and I've got a submit button, which really doesn't make sense in read mode. So that's the next part. I'm going to add a button to return navigation back to my customer by name view XPage. The next few slides provide some details on buttons. When you add a button control to an XPage, you can specify one of three types: submit, cancel, and the default button type button. For your default button type button, you must code the onClick event to specify what's going to happen when the user clicks on that button. For your submit and cancel button, their functionality is built into the type. So when you add a submit button, you don't code the onClick event. And when the user clicks on that, their input is validated and the document is submitted and saved. When a user clicks on a cancel button, the XPage is submitted. There's no validation. There's no saving of the document. To create a submit or cancel button, the first step is to specify the button type in the button properties. And the second step is to, in the XPage properties, specify this particular property, next page success or cancel, and specify the page to navigate to on a successful submission where all validation passes, or when the user clicks a cancel type button. For other button functionality, you leave the default button type as the type of the button, provide a descriptive label for the button, what it's going to do, and then in the events, code one of the events for a button, typically the onClick event, and you can add JavaScript for that event, or in this case, a simple action was used, the open page simple action, to specify a page to navigate to when the button is clicked. Buttons, and for that matter, any control you add to an XPage, includes a visible property. It actually shows as visible in the properties, but when you code this, you're actually coding the rendered property. If you take a look at the source, you'll see it's the rendered property, and you can compute its value. And this is the equivalent of your form design and computing a hide when formula, just the opposite. So under certain conditions, you do want to render, so you'll return true to the rendered property. And under other conditions, you may return false to the rendered property to not render that particular component on the XPage. So with my new knowledge of buttons, I want to make a couple of changes here on my customer document XPage. First of all, when the document is in read mode as it is now, I want to hide this submit button, and I want to add a second button here to return to the customer view XPage. Right now the user can only use the back button in the browser, and that's not very good. So I'm going to add a button to return to this customer by name view XPage. So back here in Designer, on my customer document XPage, here's the submit button that was added. When I added all of those fields from the data palette, I checked off the option to add some error messages. This control, we haven't talked about what that's for, but we'll take a look at that in the next part. And the submit button, I checked off the option for that. So a submit type button, button type submit, was added. And for your submit type buttons and for your cancel type buttons, you do not code the event. You do not code an on-click event for these buttons. All you need to do is in the outline, in your XPage properties, you need to specify this property here. Next page on a successful submit or cancel, where do you want to go? And I want to navigate to the customer by name view. So also want to add a second button. So in our core controls, adding a second button and giving it the name or the label return to view. And when you add a button from the core controls, it will automatically get the default button type. And for these, you do need to code the events, what the button is going to do. Let me just rearrange that. Let me just correct that spelling. Okay, then in the events. Now, in our events, we can code a button with server-side JavaScript, or we can use some pre-built simple actions. So sort of like your form design, where there are many simple actions available to you. You can add an action, and there are different categories of actions. There are document type actions like change document mode and delete the document, or delete the second documents on a view type XPage, or save the document, or modify a field. So different categories of actions. And the one we want is in the basic actions. So several basic actions to send mail, set a value. Here's the one we want, the open page. And the page that we want to return to is the customer by name view. And that's it. So we'll click OK to add that simple action. I can see that we have an open page simple action and going to the customer by name view. That's how I've coded that button's on click event. Okay, so let's preview that. Actually, let's just switch. Well, we're going to save that. And let's just switch to our browser. And now when I open up one of these documents, I see my submit and my return to view. And if I click this return to view, it navigates properly to this view, and I can open up another another document on my customer document XPage. And I'm going to work on this part right now, where I only want a submit button when the document is in edit mode, and the return to view should only be shown or rendered when the document is in read mode as it is now, but not in edit mode. So let's go to design of our customer document XPage. And for our submit button, in the properties, this is the property that we're going to code. It's called the visible property on the design interface in the properties view on the button tab, but in fact this is the rendered property, and almost every control will have a rendered property, and it's the opposite of your hide when property in form design, where you're going to hide something on a certain condition. Here you compute your rendered property to display, to be visible under a certain condition. And in this editor, I can compute this. Now there are a number of objects that are available to me. There are global objects, and one of the global objects is document 1. So I can double click on that, and one of the properties for that is editable. Okay, so document 1 dot is editable. Okay, and we can see some pop-up help when you hit the dot or the period. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Let's take a look at another way. So under at functions, there is an at if function. And I'm a little bit more familiar with this, so we're going to add an at if function. Okay, so I'll just double click on that, and I see many familiar functions that have been ported to my server-side JavaScript at functions library. So at if, and my document data source is called document1 dot, and here's my pop-up methods and properties, and the one that I want is editable. So under the condition where document1 is editable, now here's where I might make the mistake of using a semicolon, because that's how I do it in formula language, but this isn't formula language, this is server-side JavaScript. And to separate arguments in a method or function in server-side JavaScript, use the comma. So under the condition where document1 is editable, I'm going to return true to my visible or rendered property, otherwise false. Okay. And that's kind of how I would do it in form design using formula language coding a hide one. So let's say OK to that. Actually, before we do that, let's copy that into my clipboard and OK, as I need a similar formula for this return to view. So going to select the return to view, and for its visible / rendered property, going to compute its value with server-side JavaScript, and I want the opposite. So if not document1 is editable, then return true. So that'll render this when we're in read mode, otherwise false. Okay, so let me save that. And if I preview that to create a new document, I only see my submit button. Now I do need some more work here, so we're just going to cancel that. And when I preview my customer by name view XPage and open up an existing document in read mode, not seeing that submit button, just seeing the return to view. And of course, we saw how that worked earlier. That also completes my two-page design where I can read the documents within my application. So I've got this customer by name view XPage where I can select any one of these documents. I can page through it to select any one of our customer documents, and I can click on a link to open in the customer document XPage that document in read mode. This concludes this part of our Introduction to XPage's development series. In this part, we took a look at displaying a Domino document on an XPage, and there are additional details in the lesson and an activity as well. In the next part, we'll take a look at creating and editing Domino documents, including validation. So until then, so long for now.